The heat in Wyoming that July didn't just sit on the land. It pressed down on it, heavy and suffocating, like a wool blanket soaked in boiling water. It was a heat that silenced the birds and sent the cattle to the lowest valleys, heads hanging low, tails flicking at flies. With a slow, exhausted rhythm, the air shimmered off the ground, distorting the horizon until the mountains looked like they were melting into the sky. It was just past 5 in the afternoon when Clara finally slipped the latch on the back gate. She moved quickly, her boots kicking up small puffs of dry dust, heading toward the tree line, where the cottonwoods grew thick and tangled. She didn't have a basket on her arm. She didn't have a chore list tucked into her apron pocket. For the first time that day, perhaps for the first time that season, she had stolen a moment for herself. She walked until the house was nothing but a white speck behind her, until the only sound was the wind moving through the tall grass and the distant, rhythmic chirping of cicadas. The path she took was narrow, a deer trail that dipped down into a low basin hidden from the road, where an underground spring fed a small, darker pool of water. The lake wasn't large, maybe 60 yards across, ringed with reeds and smooth river stones. But to Clara, it looked like salvation. The water was still and glass clear, reflecting the leaves of the cottonwoods that leaned over it like protective guardians. She stopped at the edge, her breath coming short and fast. It wasn't just the walk. It was the sheer weight of the day leaving her body. Her hands, red and roughened from lye soap, trembled as she reached for the ties of her dress. She checked the clearing once, her eyes darting between the trees. No hoofbeats, no voices, just the hum of the heat and the water. One by one, she shed the layers of her life, the mended dress, stained with the grease of the kitchen, the heavy camis, stiff with starch and sweat. She folded them on a flat rock, a habit of tidiness that she couldn't break even here, in the wild. When she stepped into the water, the cold was a shock that nearly made her cry out. It bit at her ankles, then her calves, sharp and sudden against her overheated skin. She gasped, a sound that turned into a quiet, breathless laugh. She waded deeper until the water lapped at her waist, then her shoulders, and finally, she ducked her head under. For a moment, the world simply stopped. Underwater, the relentless demands of the Thorne house disappeared. The ache in her lower back, the throbbing behind her eyes, the constant fear of a harsh word, it all floated away. She stayed under until her lungs burned, then broke the surface, slicking her hair back from her face. Breathing in the air that smelled of wet earth and freedom, she stood there, water sluicing down her bare skin, the sunlight filtering through the leaves to paint gold patterns on the surface around her. In that moment, she wasn't Clara the maid. She wasn't the girl with the cracked hands and the invisible life. She was just a woman, human, alive. And then, a twig snapped. The sound was small, but in the cathedral silence of the grove, it cracked like a gunshot. Clara froze. She turned toward the bank, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Standing in the shadows of the cottonwoods, not 10 feet away, was a man. He had stopped mid-step, his hand still pushing aside a low-hanging branch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair tied back in a strip of leather and skin that held the deep bronze of the sun. It was Elias Thorne, the master's son. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring, But it wasn't the lecherous stare of the ranch hands, or the dismissive glance of his father. He looked struck, stunned, as if he had been walking through a familiar room and suddenly found a door he never knew existed. Clara's breath caught in a sharp, wounded cry. Her hands flew up, trying to cover herself, trying to shrink back into the water. "Don't," she whispered, the word barely escaping her throat. "Don't look." Elias seemed to snap back to reality. The color rose high on his cheekbones, and he turned his back sharply, his movements stiff and awkward. "I'm not," he said, his voice rough. "I swear, I didn't know anyone was here." He stood facing the tree bark, rigid as a fence post, while Clara scrambled for her clothes on the rock. But the damage was done. The silence of the lake had been broken. He had seen her, and in the Thorne house, being seen was the most dangerous thing of all. Part 2. The House of Silence. To understand why that moment in the water terrified her, you have to understand the house on the hill. The Thorne house stood on a low rise above the river, painted a white so bright it hurt the eyes under the hard Wyoming sun. It was a fortress of painted boards and tall windows, surrounded by fenced pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. From a distance, it looked settled, proud, the kind of place meant to last 100 years. Folks in town spoke of the Thorne estate with a mixture of envy and resentment. They talked about the freight contracts Silas Thorne controlled, stretching all the way to Cheyenne. They talked about the velvet drapes and the polished silver, but inside, the house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a machine. It breathed with labor, and Clara was the fuel that kept it running. She was 25 years old, though the mirror in her small attic room told a different story. Her hair, once a soft, light brown, was always pulled back tight, frizzing from the steam of the laundry tub. Her hands were her tragedy red, rough, with knuckles cracked from the cold water and the lye. Soap and ash had worked themselves so deep into the lines of her skin that no amount of scrubbing could get them out. She had been awake since 4 that morning. She had stoked the kitchen fires, scrubbed the iron pans from the night before, and hauled linens down 3 flights of stairs. Her dress had been mended so many times that the original seams were lost maps of her history. But her greatest burden wasn't the work. It was the invisibility. The other servants, 3 women and 2 men, had decided long ago that Clara was useful enough to keep, but low enough to blame. If a plate broke, it was Clara's clumsiness. If a shirt went missing, Clara's name was whispered first. She had learned to survive by becoming a ghost. She kept her eyes down. She blended into the wallpaper, into the floorboards, into the work itself. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then, her voice was a quiet apology. She thought she was the only one in that house who was alone. She was wrong. Elias Thorne lived there too, but he didn't belong there any more than she did. At 30 years of age, Elias had the build of a man shaped by the open land, broad across the shoulders, lean at the waist, moving with a quiet economy that no finishing school could teach. He was the adopted son of Silas Thorne, taken in after a trade expedition gone wrong in the New Mexico territory years ago. The town knew, though few dared to say it to his face, that Elias had been born to the tribes. He was Cheyenne by blood, Thorne by paper. Silas had brought the boy north when he was 8 years old, a child silent as stone, with dark eyes that watched everything. Silas gave him a name, a bed, an education, and clean clothes. He tried to give him a future, but what he couldn't give him was forgetfulness. Elias learned early how to walk between worlds. Inside the house, he wore the suits. He ate with a knife and fork. He sat in the parlor listening to men discuss tariffs and profit margins measured in thousands of dollars. He played the part of the dutiful son. But outside was where his soul lived, when he rode alone across the prairie, or stood by the river at dusk. He felt the older pull, the one that asked for no permission and offered no explanations. He moved through his father's house like a stranger passing through, always watching, never fully resting. Before that day at the lake, Clara and Elias had existed in the same space, orbiting each other like two planets in the dark. He would walk through the back hall, smelling the damp soap and the simmering meals, and he would see a woman on her knees scrubbing the floor. He might pause, feeling a familiar tightening in his chest, a recognition of someone else who was trapped. He might clear his throat and say, "Good morning," and she would startle, scrambling to her feet, eyes fixed on his boots. "I'm sorry, sir," she would say, apologizing for her very presence. He walked past her. She looked at the floor. That was the rule. That was the order of things. The house demanded silence, and it demanded separation. But the water had washed all of that away. When Elias walked away from the lake that afternoon, leaving Clara shivering and ashamed on the bank, he tried to tell himself to forget it. He tried to tell himself it was just a mistake. But as he climbed the stairs to his room, passing the polished mirrors and the silent portraits, he couldn't get the image out of his mind. Not the nudity, but the look on her face before the fear set in, the peace. He had seen the ghost come alive. And once you see something like that, you can never unsee it. The order of the house had been breached, and the silence was about to end. The days that followed the incident at the lake were not quiet. In a house like the Thornes, silence is never truly empty. It is heavy, filled with things unsaid. And between Elias and Clara, the silence had changed. It was no longer the indifferent quiet of two strangers passing in a hallway. It had become loud. Clara worked in a state of held breath. She avoided the front halls. She avoided the stairs. If she heard the heavy thud of Elias's boots on the floorboards, she would turn away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected anger. She expected dismissal. In her world, when a master found a servant out of place, the punishment was swift, but the punishment didn't come. Instead, something more unsettling happened. Elias began to see her. Before the lake, she had been part of the furniture to him, a pair of hands holding a tray, a shadow in the corner. Now, he couldn't look through her. When he passed the kitchen door, he noticed the way her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He noticed the red, angry marks on her forearms, where the lye soap had burned the skin. He saw the bruises that bloomed like dark flowers on her wrists from hauling water that was too heavy for her frame. He wanted to speak to her. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he hadn't meant to intrude on her one moment of peace. But he knew the rules better than anyone. A man in his position did not have private conversations with a maid, not without consequences. So he stayed silent. But his eyes followed her, filled not with the desire she feared, but with a startled, brooding respect. And that was the problem. In a house full of watching eyes, noticed, glances are dangerous currency. The other servants smelled the change in the air before Clara even understood it. It started in the kitchen, amidst the clatter of pots and the heat of the stove. It began with whispers, sharp, quick sounds, like dry leaves skittering across the floor. She thinks she's clever. Laia, the cook's niece, murmured one afternoon, kneading dough with violent, rhythmic thumps, walking around with her head down, acting like a saint. I saw her, another girl whispered, wiping her hands on a rag, coming out of the back hall right after him. Don't tell me that's nothing. Clara kept her head down. She scrubbed the pans until her fingers stung. She carried water until her arms shook, hoping that if she just worked hard enough, if she made herself small enough, the rumors would starve. But envy is a hungry thing. It doesn't need truth to feed on. It only needs opportunity. And the opportunity came on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was dropping behind the hills, turning the sky a bruised purple. Clara was called to the back of the house, told she was needed to help move storage in the woodshed. She went without question. You didn't question orders at the Thorne Ranch. But when she rounded the corner of the shed, away from the windows and the safety of the main yard, she found no boxes waiting for her. She found a circle. 3 of the other staff members stood there, blocking her path. The air was cooling, but the heat coming off them was palpable. You think we don't see you? Laia stepped forward, her voice low and venomous. Batting your eyes, slipping off whenever you please. I didn't, Clara stammered, stepping back. I haven't done anything. You think you can climb your way out of this place? Another hissed, making eyes at the master's son. You think you're better than us. Clara tried to turn, to run, but a hand grabbed her shoulder. Another grabbed her arm. They shoved her hard. She lost her balance and hit the dirt with a sickening thud. The wind knocked out of her chest. The pain bloomed sharp and hot across her back. Before she could scramble up, a boot caught her in the side. Then a hand struck her cheek. It wasn't a beating, meant to kill. It was calculated. It was enough to bruise, enough to humiliate, enough to teach a lesson without leaving marks that would show when she was dressed. You are nothing. Laia spat down at her. Don't you forget it. They left her there in the dust, shaking and gasping for air. It took Clara a long time to stand. Her dress was covered in dirt. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Tears blurred her vision, hot and stinging. But beneath the fear, something else was breaking. A dam that had held back years of silence was finally giving way. She didn't go to her room to wash. She didn't try to hide the evidence of her shame. She walked. She walked straight through the back door, past the kitchen, where the laughter stopped abruptly, and into the main hall. Elias was there. He was standing by the hearth with his father, Silas Thorne. They were reviewing freight routes and winter supply lists, discussing money and contracts. The room was a sanctuary of polished wood and order. And then Clara fell into it. She stopped in the doorway, her legs finally giving out. She dropped to her knees on the expensive rug, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Please, she sobbed, the word tearing out of her throat. Please. I didn't do what they said. The room went dead silent. Silas Thorne turned slowly, his brow furrowed in shock. He looked at the disheveled woman on his floor, the dirt on her dress, the wildness in her eyes. Child, he said, his voice stern, but startled. What in God's name? But Elias was already moving. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his face pale, his jaw set so hard, a muscle jumped in his cheek. He didn't look at his father. He looked only at her. What is this about? Silas demanded, his voice sharpening. Clara swallowed, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. She couldn't look at Elias. She looked at the floor, at the polished boots of the men who owned her world. They say Her voice broke. They say I've been distracting him, that I planned it, that I'm trying to ruin him. She was repeating the lies the servants had hissed at her. The accusations that she was a temptress, a schemer. She waited for Silas to yell. She waited for the order to pack her things and leave. Elias felt a cold rage settle in his chest. Distinct and absolute. He looked at the woman kneeling in the dirt, terrified and broken. And he felt the last tether to his father's world snap. That's a lie, Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a knife. Silas looked between them, the servant girl on the floor, and the son who stood over her. Not like a master, but like a shield. You're certain? Silas asked, his eyes narrowing. Yes, Elias said. He didn't hesitate. He didn't waver. She has done nothing. The fault is not hers. Silas let out a slow breath. He was a hard man, but he was not a fool. And he was not cruel without cause. He dismissed Clara with a wave of his hand, a gesture that was surprisingly gentle. Go rest, he said. This will be looked into. Clara bowed her head, tears dripping onto the floorboards, and fled the room. But Elias didn't move. He watched her go, and for the first time, he didn't care who saw him watching. The rumors were wrong about her intent, but they were right about one thing. Everything had changed. The house was no longer safe, and neither was his heart. The morning after the incident in the main hall, the Thorne house woke up different. It felt lighter, yet sharper, like the air after a violent thunderstorm. Elias had kept his word. By noon, the 3 servants who had cornered Clara behind the woodshed were gone. Their wages were paid. Their trunks were packed, and they were escorted off the property without a backward glance. Silas Thorne had stood on the porch, watching them go, his face unreadable. He had allowed it because justice, even his rigid version of it, demanded it. But as he watched his son stand beside the gate, arms crossed and eyes hard, Silas must have realized that the boy he had raised to be a polite, obedient heir was gone. In his place stood a man who would burn the world down to protect what was his. For Clara, the change was terrifying and wonderful all at once. Elias had come to her in the laundry room after the dust settled. He didn't touch her. Not yet. He simply stood in the doorway and said, "You are safe here. No one will touch you again." And for a short while, that was true. But safety is a strange soil for romance. It wasn't safety that pulled them together in the weeks that followed. It was recognition. The timeline of a heart doesn't always follow the calendar. Sometimes years pass in a blink, and sometimes a lifetime is lived in a single month. Summer bled into early autumn. The heat broke, and the cottonwoods began to turn a brilliant, trembling gold. And in the quiet spaces of that big, lonely house, a secret life began to bloom. It happened in the stolen moments. A glance across the dining room as she cleared the plates, lingering a second too long. The brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a bucket of water at the well. They were small things, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. But to them, they were thunderclaps. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, Clara found Elias waiting by the pasture fence. He had 2 horses saddled. "You said once you wanted to see the world," he said softly, his voice low so it wouldn't carry to the house. Even if only for a day. Clara hesitated. She looked back at the White House, the windows glowing like judging eyes. "I did," she whispered. "Then come," he said. "Just for one day." They rode out under the cover of twilight, the hooves muffled by the tall grass. They didn't stop until the ranch was miles behind them, until the fences disappeared, and there was only the open, wild land. That night, they camped under a sky so thick with stars, it looked like spilled sugar. They built a small fire. They cooked a simple meal. And they talked, not as master and servant, but as a man and a woman who had both been lonely for as long as they could remember. Elias told her about the memories he still carried of his first family, the smell of sage smoke, the feeling of being part of a circle. Clara told him about the dreams she kept hidden in a tin box under her bed. When the fire burned low, the distance between them vanished. It wasn't a seduction. It was a collision. It was the inevitable result of two souls who had finally found their mirror. For that one night, and the day that followed, they belonged only to themselves. But reality is a patient hunter. It waits at the gate. They returned before dawn, slipping back into their roles before the house awoke. But you cannot unlive a moment like that. You cannot go back to being a ghost once you have been held like a queen. Weeks passed. The leaves fell. The wind turned biting and cold. And Clara began to feel a change within her, a sickness in the mornings, a tenderness that wouldn't fade. She denied it at first. She told herself it was just the stress, just the season. But nature does not lie. The realization brought a fear so cold it nearly stopped her heart. In 1880, a woman in her position, carrying the child of a wealthy heir. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a death sentence. She tried to hide it. She wore looser aprons. She worked through the nausea, biting her lip until it bled. But news travels fast in a house of whispers, and secrets have a way of swelling until they take up all the air in the room. By late October, the secret could no longer be kept. Elias found her in the pantry one afternoon. She was leaning against the shelves, her face ashen, her hands clutching her stomach. "They know," she whispered before he could even speak. "Your parents. Everyone. They know." Elias went still. "I know," he said. "And there is more, isn't there?" She looked up at him, tears swimming in her eyes. "I am with child." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He took a step toward her. But before he could reach her, the heavy footsteps of Silas Thorne echoed in the hall. "Both of you." Silas's voice boomed, hard and controlled. The parlor. Now, this was it. The reckoning. They stood side by side before the hearth. The fire was roaring, but the room felt freezing. Silas Thorne stood by the mantel, hands clasped behind his back, looking every inch. The disappointed patriarch. Elias's adoptive mother sat in her chair, wrapped in a shawl, looking at the wall, as if Clara didn't exist. "This ends tonight," Silas said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth he had once shown the boy he took in. "Elias, you will end this foolishness immediately." He turned his gaze to Clara. It was a look of utter dismissal. "And you will leave this house by week's end, with your wages and a letter of reference. If you go quietly." Clara felt her knees weaken. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg not for herself, but for the tiny life growing inside her. But Elias spoke first. The word was simple, quiet, but it stopped Silas cold. No, Elias repeated, his voice gaining strength. I won't abandon her, and I won't pretend this is a passing fancy. You shame us. His mother hissed from her chair, her voice thin with strain. There is more, Elias said, interrupting her gently but firmly. He reached out and took Clara's hand. In front of his father, in front of the woman who raised him, he interlaced their fingers. Clara stiffened, terrified. But then she let him hold her. She is with child. Silas's face went the color of old ash. He looked at their joined hands, then at his son's defiant face. The shock turned into a cold, hard resolve. You see, Silas said hoarsely, this is exactly what I warned you of. Attachments. Carelessness. This isn't carelessness. Elias replied, it is my responsibility, mine and hers, and I will not walk away from it. Silas straightened up. He seemed to grow taller, looming over them with the full weight of his authority and his wealth. Then hear me clearly. Elias, Silas said, if you walk out that door with her, you are no longer my son. Not in this house. Not in this town. He gestured around the room at the velvet drapes, the oil paintings, the warmth of the fire. You leave with nothing. No inheritance. No name. No freight contracts. You walk out into the winter with the clothes on your back and the mistake you've made. The silence that followed was deafening. The clock on the mantel tick-tick, tick, tick, marking the seconds of a life falling apart. Clara's grip on Elias's hand tightened until her knuckles turned white. This was her nightmare. She was the maid who ruined the prince. She was the tragedy bringing down the house. She pulled her hand away and turned to him, her voice trembling. Don't, she whispered. Elias, please, you can't. She looked at him, pleading with her eyes. I will go alone. I will figure it out. Don't ruin yourself for me. Don't throw away your future for a servant girl and a mistake. It was the ultimate offering. She loved him enough to break her own heart. She loved him enough to leave him to his comfort, his wealth, and his safety. Elias looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the fear she carried. But beneath it, he saw the iron strength that had kept her alive for 25 years. He saw the woman who had washed away her invisibility in a cold lake. He saw the mother of his child. He turned back to his father. His expression wasn't angry anymore. It was calm. It was the face of a man who finally knew exactly where he belonged. I am not ruining my life, Father, Elias said softly. I am choosing it. He turned to Clara. Get your coat. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He walked to the door and held it open. Silas Thorne did not speak as they left. He turned his back to them, staring into the fire. They had an hour to pack. Clara took her spare dress, a shawl, and a tin comb. Elias took his rifle, a bedroll, and the few dollars he had in his pocket. He left the suits. He left the ledger books. He left the pocket watch his father had given him, leaving it on the dresser as a final message. They walked out of the house as the sun dipped below the horizon. A cold wind was blowing from the north, smelling of snow. A rented wagon was waiting beyond the far fence. Elias helped Clara up onto the bench seat. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. He didn't look back at the white house on the hill. He looked west, toward the open, darkening land, toward uncertainty, toward poverty, toward home. Are you afraid? Clara asked him, her voice small, in the vast darkness. Elias wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close against the cold. Yes, he admitted. But I'm free. He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels grinding against the gravel, and together they drove into the night, leaving the legacy of the Thornes behind, and beginning the legend of the river keeper's wife. They drove until the wheels of the wagon were coated in red dust, and the Thorne ranch was nothing but a memory swallowed by the horizon. They didn't head for the comforts of the nearest town. Towns were full of eyes, full of judgment, full of people who would look at a wealthy heir and a pregnant maid and whisper the word, ruin. So they went south. They went where the maps were thin and the land was wide. The journey was not a romantic promenade. It was a test. The wagon was old, the suspension unforgiving against the ruts of the game trails they followed. By day, the sun was a hammer. By night, the temperature dropped until their breath hung in clouds inside their shared blanket. But there was a strange, wild peace in it. For the first time in her life, Clara wasn't waking up to a bell. She wasn't scrubbing a floor for a master who wouldn't look at her. She was sitting beside a man who checked on her every hour, who shared his dried meat with her, who looked at the vast, empty prairie and saw a future. They found their place just before the first snow flew. It wasn't much. It was a patch of ground tucked into the foothills, near the edge of the territory, where the Apache families still moved through the seasons. There was a cabin there, if you could call it that. It was little more than 4 walls of rough-hewn pine, and a roof that let the stars peek through in 3 places. It was poor. It was hard. But it was theirs. Elias spent those first weeks working like a man possessed. He wasn't managing freight contracts or balancing ledgers anymore. He was mixing mud to chink the gaps in the logs. He was chopping wood until his hands blistered and calloused over, transforming from the soft palms of a gentleman into the working hands of a husband. The winter that year came early, and it came with a vengeance. By November, the wind cut down from the mountains like a blade, slipping through every crack Elias hadn't yet managed to seal. The snow drifted knee-high against the cabin walls, trapping them inside a world of white and gray. It was the kind of cold that settles in your marrow. Some nights, the fire burned low before morning, and they would wake with stiff fingers, seeing their breath in the dark room. Food was scarce. They lived on beans, cornmeal, and the occasional rabbit Elias managed to snare in the drifts. In the Thorne house, a winter like this would have meant roaring fireplaces in every room and heavy velvet curtains to keep the draft out. Here, it meant survival. But the strange thing was, there was joy. One morning, after a storm that had shaken the very timbers of the roof, Clara stood by the stove, stirring a thin pot of mush. She was heavy with the child now, her back aching, her ankles swollen. The wind was howling outside, a terrifying, lonely sound, and suddenly, she laughed. It wasn't a hysterical laugh. It was a genuine, bubbling sound that rose from her chest. Elias looked up from where he was mending a harness, startled. "What is it?" he asked. "I was just thinking," she said, wiping a tear from her eye. "If I were back at the house, I would be polishing silver right now. I would be warm. I would be fed." She looked around the drafty, dim cabin, and I would be dead inside. She looked at him, her eyes bright. "I am cold, Elias, and I am hungry, but I am not afraid of you, and I am not invisible." That was the trade they had made. Comfort for dignity. And neither of them wanted a refund. But the true test was yet to come. It happened on Christmas Eve. The snow had been falling for 2 days straight, piling up against the door until they had to shove it open just to get firewood. The world outside was silent, buried under a blanket of white. Inside, the fire was the only light in the universe. Clara's labor started slow, then hit hard. There was no doctor to summon, no carriage to send for a midwife. There was only the wind, the fire, and Elias. He was terrified. He had seen foals born. He had seen calves dropped in the spring mud. But this was the woman who had saved him. He boiled water because that's what he had heard you should do. He held her hand until he thought she might crush his bones. The hours stretched out, agonizing and long. Clara was small, and the labor took everything from her. There were moments, in the deepest part of the night, when Elias pressed his forehead to hers, whispering prayers in English and in the language of his birth mother, begging the spirits of the land to let her live. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Clara, you stay with me. We are building this. You don't leave now." And then, just as the wind outside began to die down, a new sound filled the cabin. A sharp, indignant cry. Elias caught his son in rough, trembling hands. The baby was small, red-faced, and furious at the cold. He was perfect. Elias wrapped him quickly in the warmest blanket they had, wiping the child's face with a tenderness that belied the strength of his arms. He laid the boy in Clara's arms. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Clara looked down at the child. Their son, Thomas. He wasn't a secret. He wasn't a shame. He was the first thing in their lives that was holy, undeniably true. Elias knelt beside the bed. He wept openly, tears tracking through the soot and sweat on his face. He pressed his forehead against Clara's, closing his eyes, breathing in the scent of her, of the blood, of the wood smoke, of the life they had made. "Welcome," he whispered to his son, his voice cracking. "You are loved." Outside, miles away, the bells of a mission might have been ringing, but they couldn't hear them. They didn't need to. For the first time in his life, Elias Thorne wasn't between worlds. He wasn't the adopted boy in the suit, or the outcast in the kitchen. He was a father. He was a husband. He was home. The winter didn't end that night, but the fear did. As the weeks turned into months, and the snow began to melt into the mud of spring, a transformation took hold of them both. Clara healed. It was slow, but it was steady. The birth had taken a toll, leaving her weak for days. But Elias stepped in. The man who had been raised to have servants now became one. He learned to cook without burning the pot mostly. He learned to wash the linens. He learned to hold the baby in the crook of his arm so Clara could sleep. And as her strength returned, something else changed in her. She began to stand straighter. The stoop in her shoulders, the posture of a woman constantly expecting a blow or a harsh command, disappeared. Her hair, which she had always kept, pulled back in a severe servant's bun, she let grow long. It hung down her back, clean and soft. But the greatest change happened in the evenings. They had no library. They had no newspapers. But they had an old Bible and a few tattered books Elias had brought in the wagon. By the light of the kerosene lamp, with the baby sleeping in a crate near the stove, Clara learned to read. It wasn't easy. Her hands were clumsy with the pencil at first. But Elias sat beside her, patient, guiding her finger across the page. "This is an A," he would say. "This word is river." She devoured the words, For 25 years, she had been locked out of the world of ideas, told that her mind was only good for remembering chore lists. Now, she was unlocking the universe. She kept a small notebook, writing down thoughts she never would have dared to speak aloud in the Thorne house. She was finding her voice. And Elias, the change in him was less visible, but deeper. The tension he had carried his whole life. But it didn't snap into anger. It snapped into peace. The shadows under his eyes lifted. He laughed more easily now. A deep, chest-rumbling sound that didn't require him to look over his shoulder to see who was watching. He worked harder than he ever had at the ranch, repairing fences, guiding wagons for neighbors, hunting. But when he came home at night, bone-tired and smelling of pine pitch, he walked through the door with a lightness in his step. "You're different here," Clara said to him one evening, watching him play with Thomas on the rug. "So are you," he replied, smiling. "I still wake up some mornings," she admitted, "thinking I hear a bell, thinking I hear your father calling for his tea." Elias reached out and took her hand, the hand that was no longer cracked and bleeding, but strong and capable. "Then remember," he said softly, "there is no one here to ring it, and no one ever will again." The snow melted, the grass turned green, and on that small patch of land, amidst the hardship and the wind, a family had taken root. They had survived the winter, and now they were ready to live. Spring came slowly that third year, but when it arrived, it turned the valley into a riot of green. The snowmelt fed the creeks, and the patch of earth Elias had fought so hard to clear. It was a Tuesday afternoon, indistinguishable from any other. Elias was mending a section of the split-rail fence, sweat darkening his shirt. Clara was hanging laundry on the line, watching 3-year-old Thomas chase a butterfly through the tall grass. Then, a shadow fell across the ridge. Elias saw it first. He went still, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle, propped against the cabin wall. Riders didn't come this far out by accident. The figure approached at a measured walk. The horse was fine-blooded, but the man in the saddle sat heavy, slumped forward, as if the weight of the sky was too much for him. As he drew closer, the features became clear. The sharp suit was dusty. The face was gaunt, the lines around the mouth carved deep by time and isolation. It was Silas Thorne. He didn't look like the titan of industry who had commanded the parlor 3 years ago. He looked like a man who had won an argument but lost his life. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing, leaving his horse untethered. He stood there, hat in hand, looking at the small cabin, the straight fence lines, the smoke curling from the chimney. Clara froze in the doorway, her hand going to her throat. Thomas ran to her, hiding behind her skirts, peeking out with wide, dark eyes. Silence stretched between the men, thick and heavy. "I didn't know if you'd see me," Silas said finally. His voice was raspy, unused to humility. Elias didn't step forward. He didn't offer a hand. "Why are you here?" he asked. Silas looked past him. He looked at the woman he had called a mistake. He looked at the child he had tried to erase. "The house." Silas started, then stopped. He took a breath. "The house is quiet. Too quiet. My wife's health has steadied, but her spirit, she is a ghost in her own room." He swallowed hard. "I came to see my grandson." The words hung in the clean mountain air. It was an admission of defeat. The great Silas Thorne, with all his contracts and his silver, was starving. He was starving for the one thing his money couldn't buy: life. Elias glanced at Clara. In the old days, in the White House on the hill, Clara would have waited for an order. She would have waited to be told what to do, what to feel, where to stand. But that woman was gone. Clara stepped off the porch. She walked across the grass, the hem of her simple dress brushing the tops of the dandelions. She stopped in front of the man who had cast her out into the winter with nothing. She saw the regret in his eyes. She saw the loneliness that terrified him, and she chose grace. "Thomas," she said softly, coaxing the boy forward. "This is your grandfather." She picked up her son and held him out. Silas hesitated. His hands, usually so sure when signing checks, shook as he reached out. "May I?" he whispered. Clara nodded. Silas took the boy. He held him awkwardly at first, like something fragile and unfamiliar. Then he pulled the child close. Tears slipped down his weathered cheeks, tracking through the road dust, falling without sound. "I was wrong," he choked out, looking at Elias, then at Clara. "About more than I knew." He didn't stay long. He left before dusk, pressing a small pouch of coins into Elias's hand, not as charity this time, but as tribute. He rode back toward his empty white mansion, leaving the richest family in the territory behind him. The reflection: years have a way of moving like water, fast in the rapids, slow in the pools, but always forward. Decades passed. The world shifted. Railroads cut across the land, screaming with steam and iron. Towns grew into cities. Old certainties thinned like worn leather. The Callaway house, the Thorne estate, still stands on its rise by the river, but the whiteboards are weathered gray now. The porch railings are dulled by time. Travelers point it out as a curiosity, a relic of a time when men thought they could rule the land by building fences. It is a museum of silence. But further west, where the mountains hold up the sky, there is a house that is never quiet. The cabin grew. 2 rooms were added. Then a sturdy porch built by Elias's own hands. The fields expanded. Modest, but dependable. Clara and Elias grew old there. The black hair turned to silver, the smooth skin mapped with the lines of laughter and sun. Thomas grew tall, and after him came a daughter, Mary, stubborn and bright. One autumn evening, when the work was done and the air smelled of dry grass, Elias and Clara rode back to the place where it all began. They returned to the lake. The water was the same, clear, cold, patient. The cottonwood tree still leaned over the surface. Listening, they stood at the edge. 2 elders holding hands, their fingers interlaced, just as they had been in the parlor that terrible night. "This is where I stopped being invisible," Clara said softly, watching the sunlight play on the ripples. "And this is where I stopped pretending," Elias replied. They didn't need to speak of the hardship. They didn't need to speak of the cold winters or the lean years. The land knew. The water knew. Elias looked at his wife. He saw the girl by the washtub, the woman in the wagon, the mother by the fire. He saw the bravery that had built a world out of nothing. He realized then that he didn't regret a single step, because some lives are not meant to be easy. They are meant to be chosen. He gave up a fortune for her. She gave up her fear for him. And standing there, under the vast, golden sky of the West, they knew the truth. They were the richest people in the territory. Thank you for walking this path with Elias and Clara. From the silence of the big house to the freedom of the open plains. If this story moved you, if you believe that true wealth isn't found in a bank account, but in the hand you hold when the storm rolls in. Please take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone you love. There are 1,000 stories hidden in the history of the West, and I can't wait to tell you the next one. Until then, keep your fences strong and your fires burning. Thank you for listening.